Welcome back to another episode, all. Throughout this episode, I'm going to take you through a historical trail of why is the neurodiversity movement even occurring, what's caused it. That's what we're going to discuss throughout this session. Let's get started. We lost the truth of neurodiversity in 1835 due to the newly developed concept of normality. When Adolf Quetelet embarked on gathering data on variables such as height and weight, he calculated the mean for the average man. His findings garnered significant support for the idea of normality. His research led scientists, including pathologists, to develop the flawed concept of standardizing humanity, which was previously considered a diverse species. The average of 5, 7, 12, 6, and 15 is 9. Yet 9 doesn't fit any of the original 5 subjects. In the same sense, not one human fits into an average. Average itself is merely a statistical artifact. The human condition is composed of many continuums, with each person existing at various points along those continuums. Therefore, some non-disabled individuals may be socially awkward. There is a continuum of sociality within the human condition, and anyone could fall on the lower end of it. Similarly, there is an introvert to an extrovert continuum, with individuals positioned at various points based on their preferences for social interaction. These continuums intersect, creating even more diversity. The sociality continuum and the introvert to extrovert continuums overlap. Further continuums, such as a mood continuum, come into play. A person's mood affects not only their sociality, but also their thoughts and motivation, further connecting individuals to various continuums. Humanity can be described as a forest, where every leaf occupies a distinct branch, such as a person occupying a distinct family, in various places, such as various cultures, on various trees, representing various countries, then all the trees together create the forest, which could represent the world. Every leaf has a unique life experience and develops at a different pace, in a different place. No two leaves are identical. Can anyone validly standardize the life of a leaf in a forest with a single set of statistical artifacts? If not, what makes people think humanity can be standardized? Another way to consider this is by imagining if 20 of your friends and family wrote biographies about you and gave those 20 biographies to some neighbours to read, would the neighbours recognise that they had read 20 biographies about the same person? Or would they believe they had read about 20 different individuals based on the variations in what each writer knows about you? Humanity is not uniform, it is diverse. That's how scientists lost truth. They standardized everything about humans and created a non-existent entity. The scientific writer Matt Ridley notes, I quote, "The Human Genome Project is founded upon a fallacy. There is no such thing as the human genome. Neither in space nor in time can such a definite object be defined. At hundreds of different loci, scattered throughout the 23 chromosomes, there are genes that differ from person to person. Nobody can say that blood group A is normal and O, B, and AB are abnormal. So when the Human Genome Project publishes the sequence of the typical human being, what will it publish for the ABO gene on chromosome 9? The project's declared aim is to publish the average or consensus sequence of 200 different people. But this would miss the point with the case of the ABO gene, because it is a crucial part of its function that it should not be the same in everybody. Variation is an inherent and integral part of the human, or indeed any genome." End of quote. The same principle applies to human development. If there is diversity in neurological development, we should anticipate diversity in human development as well. Just as the standard human lacks a tangible existence, developmental milestones are artificial as well. Man-made expectations that reinforce the concept of normality rather than evolving around humanity itself. Everything else in biology exhibits variation in its development. So what makes humans an exception? When scientists created the average man, a non-existent entity, and used it as a reference for all humans, they constructed a new pathological paradigm that is now considered normality. As previously stated, the average man does not exist. It is a statistical fiction. Therefore, how is the concept of the average man beneficial for fields such as medicine, government, education, or leading a fulfilling life? Is it helpful in any way? According to Quatlater himself, the average man is the impossible man. Any brain that deviates from the perceived norm automatically became pathological. For instance, less than a century ago, being gay was defined as a pathological disorder. But was it ever? In the mid-19th century, pathology and human development lost touch with the truth, deeming human diversity as wrong. This, in turn, has led to many problems in other areas. Once humanity was standardized, the truth of neurodiversity was obscured and replaced with typicality and atypicality. Doesn't it strike you as odd that while no one can define what is normal with valid reasoning, I find it so easy to label something as abnormal? Anatomists and physiologists never discovered or defined the normal human. Instead, they studied and defined its opposite, the pathological state. They define normal as what is not abnormal. Yet, we do have a definition of normal today, don't we? Normal isn't just what is not abnormal. It is the archetype of an upper, middle class, heterosexual, able-bodied, mentally sound, married white man with 2.5 children. So, where did this stereotype come from? The 0.5 child notion gives us a clue about its origin. You've never met 0.5 of a child, because there is no such thing. 0.5 children is an abstraction derived by adding up all of the children in the country and then dividing this by the number of families, providing the average number of children per household. What is average is often referred to as normal, and what is referred to as normal often becomes the social norm. Originally, normal had no connection to people, society, nor behaviour. So how did it become part of our societal standards? It all comes down to Francis Galton, Carl Pearson, Ronald Fisher, and their eugenics. Eugenics is the scientifically erroneous and immoral theory of racial improvement and selective breeding, which gained popularity during the early 20th century. Eugenics were already worldwide. It was not just the Nazis in Germany, as many assume. Eugenicists believed they could produce paradise on Earth and eliminate so-called social ills through genetics and heredity. They believed the use of methods such as involuntary sterilization, segregation, and social exclusion would rid society of individuals deemed by them to be unfit. Scientific racism is an ideology that appropriates the methods and legitimacy of science to argue for the superiority of white Europeans and the inferiority of non-white people whose social and economic status have been marginalized. Like eugenics, scientific racism grew out of the misappropriation of revolutionary advances in medicine anatomy, and statistics during the 18th and 19th centuries, Charles Darwin's theory of evolution through the mechanism of natural selection, and Gregor Mendel's laws of inheritance. Eugenic theories and scientific racism drew support from contemporary xenophobia, anti-Semitism, sexism, colonialism, and imperialism, as well as justifications of slavery, especially in the United States. Francis Galton, an English statistician, demographer, and ethnologist, coined the term eugenics in 1883. Galton defined eugenics as the study of agencies under social control that may improve or impair the racial qualities of future generations, either physically or mentally. Galton claimed that health and disease, as well as social and intellectual characteristics, were entirely determined by genes, heredity, and the concept of race. During the 1870s and 1880s, discussions of human improvement and the ideology of scientific racism became increasingly common. Experts determined individuals and groups of people to be either superior or inferior. They believed biological and behavioral characteristics were fixed and unchangeable, and placed individuals, populations, and nations inside of a social hierarchy. By the 1920s, eugenics had become a global movement. There was popular governmental support for eugenics in Germany, the United States, Great Britain, Italy, Mexico, Canada, and other countries. Statisticians, economists, anthropologists, sociologists, social reformers, geneticists, health professionals, and members of the general public supported eugenics through academic and popular literature. The most well-known application of eugenics occurred in Nazi Germany in the lead up to World War II and the Holocaust. The Nazi German racial state between 1933 and 1945 used its resources to cleanse the German people and the Nazi state of those they deemed unworthy of life. Nazis in Germany, Austria, and other occupied areas euthanized at least 70,000 adults and 5,200 children. They forced sterilization that claimed at least 400,000 victims. This culminated in the near destruction of the Jewish people, as well as an effort to eliminate other marginalized minorities, such as individuals with disabilities and the LGBTQ people. The eugenics movement especially flourished before the end of World War II. Eugenic practices such as involuntary sterilization, forced institutionalization, social ostracism, and stigma were common until at least the 1970s and have continued to this day among many populations. With the completion of the Human Genome Project, and more recently advances in biotechnologies like screening and CRISPR, there is some concern about whether generating an increasing amount of genomic information in the prenatal setting would lead to new societal pressures to terminate pregnancies where the fetus is at a heightened risk for so-called genetic disorders, such as Down syndrome. Statistical techniques such as polygenic risk scores that can estimate risk for more genetically complex disorders have raised concerns among ethicists that their use in the context of in vitro fertilization and pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. The possible genomic-based screening of embryos for behavioral, psychosocial, or intellectual traits would be reminiscent of the history of eugenics in its attempt to eliminate certain individuals. Some geneticists view both genomic screening and genetic counseling as an extension of eugenics. Francis Galton, Carl Pearson, and Ronald Fisher are who I call the trinity of eugenics. What we now call statistics and statistical techniques fall upon these three men. Like Francis Galton created the normal distribution curve, regression to the average, and correlation and regression analysis. Francis Galton is the father of biostatistics. Carl Pearson is responsible for techniques such as correlation coefficient, chi-squared test, and developing the histogram. Ronald Fisher is responsible for techniques like the F distribution, linear discriminant analysis, and analysis of variance, to name a few. As all modern science is based on statistics, it is worth noting the statistical techniques are all because of these three men. Modern science is based on the ideas and techniques of racist, homophobic eugenicists. Their works place them in positions of power in the science community, including the health services. Now ask yourself, what would three white men who are racist homophobes view as paradise on earth? As the eugenics movement became global, what they saw as paradise on earth began to occur, and biological racism was created. A few parts of what they saw as paradise is Black people are half apes and educationally subhuman. All females are physically and intellectually inferior compared to men. LGBTQ are feeble-minded and inferior. All disabled people are inferior and not even human. The Nazi Holocaust, World War II, all caused by the ideologies of these three men. Ideally, statisticians would like to divorce these statistical tools from the lives of the people who created them. Statistics, as a lens through which scientists investigate real-world questions, has always been smudged by the fingerprints of the people holding the lens. Statistical and eugenic thinking are, in fact, deeply intertwined, and many of the theoretical problems with methods, like significance testing, first developed to identify racial differences and remnants of their original purpose to support eugenics. Jerry Bergman writes, I quote, "Biological racism, as we know it today, did not exist throughout most of history. Racism has a surprisingly recent origin and parallels the rise of evolutionary thought. At the earliest, it can be traced back to the resonance. If all races were equally fit, as indeed they are, evolution could not occur, because whether or not a particular race survived would depend on chance, not the alleged superiority of the race. Race is not a biological, but a sociological construct." End of quote. Galton, Pearson, and Fisher didn't just add new tools to the toolbox. In service to their socio-political agenda, they established the statistician as an authority figure, a numerical referee who is by nature impartial, they claimed, since statistical analysis is just unbiased. Even in their own work, they revealed how thin the myth of objectivity always was. The various upheavals happening in statistics today, methodological and symbolic, should probably be understood as parts of a larger story, a reinvention of the discipline and a reckoning with its origins. The buildings and lectures are the monuments to eugenics, we can say. The less visible ones are embedded in the language, logic, and philosophy of statistics itself. Statistics never understand the story. Statistics just sell you a story and they never catch the full picture. There is something which we call social Darwinism, or we could claim it is societal pathology. Societal pathology, from my view, is a sociological form of pathology. It is based on the concept of normality and what society sees as socially desirable. It could be called neuronormativity. Since values and social norms change, who is considered to be pathological changes? The groups of people stigmatized by the eugenics movement were all considered pathological and feeble-minded, to be sterilized involuntarily. Left-handedness, darker skin, LGBTQ, women, and more were all defined pathological and feeble-minded less than a century ago, as they were not considered normal. Earlier, when I said eugenics are still around and not gone, let me share a few examples. When someone doesn't pay their bills, they get blacklisted, with blacklist meaning a list of people or things that are regarded as unacceptable or untrustworthy and should be excluded or avoided. And whitelist means a list of people or things considered to be acceptable or trustworthy. Then we have white lies, which are harmless or trivial lies, especially ones told to avoid hurting someone's feelings. And black lies are telling a lie to gain a personal benefit, and they're universally condemned. I assume you can see where all this black and white language and their meanings come from. Racism. Francis Galton, Carl Pearson, and Ronald Fisher all saw who they classified as black people as unacceptable and white people acceptable, and only black people should be condemned for lies and white should be considered innocent. Originally, there are no such things as black people and white people. This is something I call racialization. Skin color is a continuum. It's not you're in one out of two classes. This black and white language is still on application forms today. Looking at the diagnostic criteria in the manuals, most disorders are just a list of social biases, behaviors that deviate from social norms, and what social norms view as acceptable. Since social norms continually change, and what people are willing to accept changes, disorders get put in and taken back out of the manuals. When the world was very homophobic, they found homosexuality socially undesirable and placed it in the manual of disorders. I still remember homosexuals in the 1990s being frightened of exposing themselves or being accused as gay because of how society treated and judged them. Dr. Nick Walker writes, I quote, "The choice to frame the minds, bodies, and lives of autistic people or any other neurological minority group in terms of pathology does not represent an inevitable and objective scientific conclusion, but is merely a cultural value judgment. Similar pathologizing frameworks have been used time and again to lend an aura of scientific legitimacy to all manner of other bigotry and to the oppression of women, indigenous peoples, people of colour, and queer people, among others. The framing of autism and other minority neurological configurations as disorders or medical conditions begins to lose its aura of scientific authority and objectivity when viewed in this historical context. For some years prior to the American Civil War, the desire of slaves to escape from slavery was diagnosed by some white physicians as a medical disorder called drapetomania. End of quote. Take notice of where Nick Walker says, lend an aura of scientific legitimacy, because people who trust science so much without questioning the professionals for social biases, all the social injustices and human rights violations are sustained and rationalized by main academia. If you look at all the political social justice movements, you'll see they're all by the people who were or still are deemed inferior by eugenicists because they deviated from what was considered socially desirable. The eugenics movement deemed women as intellectually and physically inferior, and after the movement retreated, the women's rights movement began. The LGBTQ were deemed inferior and feeble-minded. Then the gay and lesbian rights movement began. All disabled people were deemed inferior, and we now have a disability rights movement, and then it turned into the neurodiversity movement. All the 20th and 21st century political, social justice movements were caused by the eugenics movement. They are all counter movements. Sociobiology first originated in the 1940s. The concept of sociobiology did not get much recognition. It came into light after the publication of a book by Wilson based on sociobiology. It is no surprise sociobiology came about in the 1940s, but it's just like the eugenics movement. Both believe social behavior is genetically deterministic, and what's considered to be average is considered to be normal, and that which is considered to be normal is considered to be social. Besides Hitler and the Nazis, the other eugenicists were not reckless enough to start such a scene, causing enough drama to frustrate eugenics. Before 1940, eugenics were already discredited and proven false on rocky footing. The bigotry and cultural prejudice kept it ongoing. The Nazi Holocaust was simply the last straw that brought the bad name upon eugenics, not that they were discredited. Eugenics and genome editing are related but not the same. I would just like to explain the difference so you can understand velvet eugenics. Francis Galton coined eugenics after the Greek term eugene, which means well-born or good at birth. Well-born gives away. Eugenics means being born in what is seen as good. Eugenics are all done before birth by selective breeding. The eugenicists disallowed disabled people and others marginalized to marry and give birth to children to prevent genes they saw as inferior being passed on to the next generation. They made who they saw as smart people, made other smart people to give birth to smart people. Gilbert Keith Chesterton said, I quote, "This is the interesting conclusion. It is on this degree of knowledge that we are asked to abandon the universal morality of mankind. When we have stopped the lover from marrying the unfortunate woman he loves, when we have found him another uproariously healthy female whom he does not love in the least, even when we have no logical evidence that the result may not be as horrid and dangerous as if he had behaved like a man of honor." End of quote. Genome editing, sometimes called genetic engineering on the other hand, can be done after birth by genetic manipulation instead. Scientists can replace or remove pieces of DNA to cure many genetic diseases. As an example, if someone has 2 copies of the sickle cell mutation, they will likely develop sickle cell anemia. With biotechnology like CRISPR, CRISPR gene editing can cure sickle cell anemia by modifying a patient's blood stem cells to produce more fetal hemoglobin. So with biotechnology, they have the potential to eradicate genes associated with disabilities, just like the eugenics movement is attempting to eradicate all disabled people, disallowing them to pass their genes to the next generation. So eugenics and genetic engineering are related, but not the same. Ryan Boren wrote, I quote, "Utilizing genome manipulation tools and performing genetic selection is tantamount to engaging in what Rosemary calls velvet eugenics, enforced by laissez-faire commercialism rather than by the state. Velvet eugenics seems like common sense, yet it hides its violence and inequality behind claims of patient autonomy and under a veil of voluntary consent. Ultimately, market-driven velvet eugenics embodies a similar goal of purging unacceptable human variations that campaigns to eliminate the supposedly unfit and inferior have held in the past. Both enact a mandate to exclude people with disabilities from coming into the world." End of quote. The ideology of editing out all disabilities, disorders, diseases, etc. is just another utopian fantasy and foolish, by the majority seeing this as common sense. To edit all genetic disabilities out of the genome, it raises concern about informed consent. It is a very bad idea to let parents and the general public who are not educated about such science to be the decision makers. Since people are so willfully trusting a fantasy, they clearly don't know what they're walking into, and they're failing to learn from the history. To stay at an elementary level for now, genes determine our susceptibility to various diseases. Changing genes won't make an individual immune to diseases. It will just change which diseases the person is susceptible to. There are two sides to every coin. The same genes can protect you from some diseases, and those very same genes can make you more susceptible to other diseases. Like if CCR5 is removed from an embryo, the embryo will grow into a person immune to HIV infections, which does sound good. But if you remove CCR5, you also make the person significantly more susceptible to West Nile disease. Jerry Bergman wrote, I quote, "Of the identified diseases, over 5,000 are a result of heritable mutations, and none of these 5,000 existed in our past before the mutation causing it was introduced into the human gene pool. As these mutations accumulate, a deterioration of the genome called devolution results, an event that is the opposite of the eugenics goal of trying to create the most flawless race and then limit reproduction to members of this race. This goal is flawed because the accumulation of mutations tends to result in all races becoming less perfect." End of quote. One of the genes I see most people talking about manipulating are genes to enhance intelligence. Those who do want to enhance intelligence through genetic engineering, it's no surprise to me that they want to. It takes a very unintelligent person to think of such a thing. All intelligent people know that the more they learn, the biggest lesson they learn is just how little humans know about all there is to know. Is it intelligent to cause premature extinction? Would an intelligent person suggest that? I've seen people with above average IQ suggest we do so much which is stupid. The so-called intelligent people with high IQs then say, I didn't know that. It's not intelligent of the person with high IQ to make such suggestions about things the high IQ person doesn't know about. I would say that even the people with the highest IQ scores can still be the most stupid and thoughtless people, blinded by wishful thinking. IQ is clearly an ideology, not a valid way to measure intelligence. Manipulating genes won't enhance intelligence, and intelligence is not genetically deterministic, nor just the ability to possess knowledge. Scientists have continued to this day to use statistics to lend scientific legitimacy to carry forward their political views. As I quoted Nick Walker, pointing out that when the historical context of describing minorities as disorders is brought up, pathology loses its scientific authority and is exposed as a subjective social judgment, which illustrates what's considered a disorder today is indeed political. We could say most disorders are socially deterministic. I think Charles Spurgeon put it the best way, a quote I really like from him. Charles Spurgeon said, I quote, "Wisdom is the right use of knowledge. To know is not to be wise. Many men know a great deal, and are all the greater fools for it. There is no fool so great a fool as a knowing fool, but to know how to use knowledge is to have wisdom." End of quote. As genetic research advanced and as people the eugenicists deemed as inferior became recognized, eugenics became very questionable. Eugenicists believed criminality is heritable. In America, eugenicists ignored the crimes of white people and only took notice of black people committing crime. Just like an American police officer murdered an innocent black person during the racial justice movement, Black Lives Matter, and this exposed their confirmation bias and political agendas. Researchers found that eugenics conclusions and theories to be inconsistent, and they found the relationship between the genotype and phenotype are not as simplistic as they originally thought. J.B.S. Haldane pointed out that a perfectly genetically uniform society will still produce an imperfect society, because those that were strong in one environment may not be as strong in the new environment, and that genetic diversity is essential, as it will always allow some to survive environmental changes. Those who were weak in the previous environment may be stronger in the new environment to come. I quote Jerry Bergman, "Another problem was that very little was known about genetics at the turn of the century. Scientists slowly turned against the movement, or at least against some of the major aspects of the mainland movement. Included were Herman J. Muller, J.B.S. Haldane, Herbert Jennings, and even Julian Huxley. Not only advances in science, but also political changes, most notably the abuses in Nazi Germany, but also in America. Once they became known, caused many to realize that the basic eugenics conclusions were not just wrong, but inconsistent with basic human rights." End of quote. Eventually, the American general public turned against the eugenics movement as more abuses arose and more blatant false conclusions came from eugenicists. At first, people were afraid to speak up against respected scientists, because if they spoke against the eugenics, they would lose their job. Like many people already had the criticism and evidence that not everything about humans, like criminality, is genetic. but pointed out that not everyone with epilepsy, blindness, and other disabilities passed their disability onto their children. Regardless of valid criticisms, they wouldn't speak up. Eugenicists worked more like a cult than a science discipline, and cults tend to be self-destructive. But eugenicists were attempting to produce the perfect human race. But what would happen when one eugenicist deems another eugenicist inferior? In America, there was a German Jewish immigrant, Franz Boas, who was also a respected scientist and anthropologist, respected by both other professional scientists and the general public. When he attacked the eugenics movement, people listened and turned against the movement, leading to its temporary downfall in America and many other places. However, the eugenics movement did not cease. Its supporters decided to hide in the shadows in silence. The Germans adopted eugenic ideology. Adolf Hitler was made Chancellor of Germany in 1933, following some victories by the Nazis. Hitler ruled until his death by suicide in April 1945. Upon achieving power, Hitler intended to produce the perfect German race. To expand his people, he needed more land. He saw the Polish as genetically inferior, so he targeted Poland on September 1st, 1939, and started the European phase of World War II. Rhetoric of eugenics in the making of the perfect German race and racial hygiene, Germany extended eugenic ideology beyond legalized forced sterilization to eliminate the Jewish. The United States and Great Britain became more and more concerned over their own support towards improving the human race and racial hygiene. Scientists, physicians, and politicians started denouncing eugenics publicly. In the United States, eugenic institutions were closed in 1939. The very fact eugenicists became concerned, whether from a political or scientific standpoint, about eugenics in general, and not just the Nazi Holocaust, exposes they knew from the start just how immoral and evil their ideology was. The righteous have no need to fear their own deeds. So why were eugenicists so concerned when the Holocaust could just be described as murder and an act of genocide? I'm close to sure all the scientists could see the Nazis' goal was actually no different to their own goal. The Nazis just wanted to reach the goal sooner. After World War II and the uncovering of the Nazi Holocaust, eugenics were greatly stigmatized. Once stigmatized, those who supported it as a legitimate science began to deny it as a science by claiming it was a failed pseudoscience. Eugenics were globally respected as a science. The Human Genome Project still denies they genuinely saw it as a respected science. Eugenics were erased and replaced from organization and publication names. In 1954, Britain's Annals of Eugenics was renamed Annals of Human Genetics. In 1972, the American Eugenics Society adopted the less offensive name Society for the Study of Social Biology. Its publication, once popularly known as the Eugenics Quarterly, had already been renamed Social Biology in 1969. Rachel Davis says, I quote, "In May 2010, historian Herwig Cizek discussed the work of pediatrician Hans Asperger at the symposium in Vienna. The audience listened in shock, silence as he explained the evidence he had uncovered that exposed Asperger's collusion in the Nazi euthanasia program. It was just so good to be true, but Asperger allegedly saved children from the murder campaign and was an active opponent of the Nazis, but at the same time had an unhindered career under National Socialism, explained Cizek. Since then, he has continued to research the extent of medical crimes under the Nazi regime and unearth the names and life stories of the victims. End quote. Hans Asperger, he kept sending all the individuals who he saw as less intelligent to be murdered by the Nazis, and it was approximately 800 children. But also developed what would be called Asperger syndrome later on, around the 1980s, where the individuals he spared with the stereotype like Albert Einstein. Anyone who he thought would be able to work, he spared them. But anyone who he thought would not be able to work, he sent to the Nazis to be killed. During the eugenics movement in the early 20th century, someone called Margaret Sanger founded what's called the birth control movement. Sanger became a lifelong women's reproductive rights activist. In her later life, Sanger spearheaded the effort that resulted in the modern birth control pill by 1960. Born on the 14th of September 1879 in New York, just before Francis Galton coined the term eugenics, the daughter of Michael Hennessy Higgins and Anna Purcell Higgins, a Catholic Irish woman, Margaret Sanger's life was shaped by poverty, and when her mother died at the age of 50, which Sanger assumed was the result of 11 pregnancies, she later became a nurse, completing a training program at White Plains Hospital in 1902, as the eugenics movement was progressing. That year, she married William Sanger, an architect, and moved to Hastings, New York, where they had 3 children. In New York, Margaret and William Sanger became involved with progressive era activists and intellectuals, such as Max Eastman, Emma Goldman, and Upton Sinclair. Margaret joined the Women's Committee of New York in the Socialist Party and took part in women's labor protests, such as strikes in Lawrence, Massachusetts in 1912 at Paterson, New Jersey in 1913. Sanger strongly believed that controlling family size was the way to prevent poverty, but at the time it was illegal to share and distribute birth control information. It was around this time people like J.B.S. Holden was turning against the main beliefs of the eugenicists because of inconsistent results and how it was violating human rights. Working as a visiting nurse, Sanger frequented the homes of poor immigrants with large families and women whose health was impaired by too many pregnancies, miscarriages, or in desperation botched abortions. Now you've got to ask, why didn't she visit wealthy families? Associating wealth and poverty aligns with one of the goals of the eugenics movement, purging the world of the financial burden. These are all signs of confirmation bias. Sanger made it her mission to 1, provide women with birth control information, and 2, repeal the federal Comstock law, which prohibited the distribution of obscene materials through the mails and regarded birth control information as such. In 1914, Sanger made a publication of her own called The Woman Rebel. Advocating for birth control, she was charged with violating the Comstock laws and fled to England. She returned a year later to stand trial, but when her 5-year-old daughter died unexpectedly, the court was pressurized by the public, which led to the charges against Sanger being dropped. In 1916, Sanger opened the first birth control clinic in Brooklyn, Less than a week later, she was arrested and sent to jail for 30 days. Her arrest garnered the media's attention and brought her supporters. Birth control was influenced by the eugenics movement, as most of America still supported eugenics, as do people around the globe today. Sanger appealed for conviction, and even though she lost, the court decided that doctors would prescribe contraceptives to women for medical reasons. Even the court supported eugenic beliefs, as they approved targeting the people they falsely medicalized through cultural prejudice. The approval for doctors to prescribe contraceptives gave Sanger the opportunity to open a clinic in 1923 with female doctors and social workers, which later became the Planned Parenthood Federation of America. Sanger started the Birth Control Review in 1917 and founded the American Birth Control League in 1921 to gain support from other social and medical professionals, and additionally the public for birth control. In 1929, she formed the National Committee on Federal Legislation for Birth Control to lobby Congress for legislation that would permit doctors to prescribe birth control. Despite resistance from doctors and the Catholic Church throughout her activist career, over time, Sanger's efforts led to the legalization and widespread usage of contraceptives in the United States. In 1936, the courts made it legal for doctors to prescribe birth control. 1936 is around the time America had inspired Adolf Hitler and the Nazis for the Holocaust and World War II. In 1971, the Comstock laws were ended, nearly a century after their passage. Margaret Sanger's obsession with birth control at times had unintended results. She was an active participant in the eugenics movement, trying to breed out undesirable populations by limiting their ability to procreate through birth control and forced sterilization. Sanger saw birth control signs preventing birth defects. She disagreed with the racial and class focus of the eugenics movement. This is why the women's rights movement has always been done in vain. As long as women demonize disabled females, saying they don't have the right to be born, there will never be equality among the sexes. Sanger retired in 1942 and remained a passionate advocate for birth control. In the late 1950s, with funding from international harvester heiress Catherine McCormick, Sanger recruited someone called Gregory Pincus to develop an oral contraceptive. The pill was approved by the Food and Drug Administration in 1960. Sanger died in 1966 at the age of 86. The fact that birth control is no different to eugenics, and that the Courts and Food and Drug Administration approved of it in 1960, illustrates that the eugenics movement did not end with the Nazi Holocaust and World War II. The ancient philosopher Plato said, I quote, "He who does not desire power is fit to hold it." Close quote. I entirely agree, and it reminds me of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. Near the end, when Harry Potter wakes up after confronting Professor Quirrell and Lord Voldemort, Professor Albus Dumbledore enters the scene. Harry then asks Dumbledore how he got the Philosopher's Stone from the magic mirror. Dumbledore then answers, you see, only a person who wanted to find the stone, find it, but not use it, would be able to get it. End of quote. All the eugenicists who desire power and control over nature to this day are the very people who can't control power. Knowledge is power. Misusing power is abuse. And since knowledge is power, that's abuse of power. The very fact that here in the 21st century, who's entitled to be born is a political vote, illustrates people want to abuse power meaning that the eugenics movement is still ongoing. It is not yet over. As people with developmental disabilities are still deemed inferior by the ongoing eugenics movement, once the movement was publicly rebranded as genetics and social biology, the intellectually disabled were institutionalized in places like the Willowbrook State Developmental Center in New York. In the Willowbrook Center from the 1950s to the 1980s, disabled people were being despicably used for experimentation and were being tortured as the eugenics movement deems them not even human. The political movements for equal human rights were starting. The start of the movement served as the impetus for accelerating the pace of community placements for people with developmental disabilities, increasing community services, increasing the quality and availability of day programs, and gaining the right of children with disabilities to an education. Willowbrook was a set of buildings to institutionalize children and adults with developmental disabilities. By 1970, there were over 6,000 residents living in these buildings, which were only meant to have a maximum of 4,000 residents. Understaffed, overpopulated, and low funding was more like a laboratory. By the institution being overpopulated, it provided the opportunity for abuse, dehumanization, and a health crisis. At the time, hepatitis was so dominant that researchers took the situation to their advantage. They used the residents for controversial clinical trials, intentionally exposing them to a deadly virus without their consent, in order to test vaccines, just like today's researchers experiment on rodents, which testifies the ideas of eugenicists were still among the population. In 1965, Senator Robert Kennedy paid an unannounced visit to Willowbrook. He found thousands of residents living in filth and dirt, their clothing in rags, in rooms less comfortable and cheerful than the cages in which we put animals in a zoo. Kennedy went on to describe the institution as a snake pit. The visit put Willowbrook into the national spotlight, and the state of New York responded by developing a 5-year improvement plan. However, after making some adjustments, conditions at the institution quickly changed back to the inhumane conditions that had put it into the national spotlight in the first place. In 1972, a news reporter called Geraldo Rivera drew public attention to the Willowbrook Center by exposing it on the television. He called the exposure Willowbrook, the Last Disgrace. It exposed the institution's overpopulation, dehumanization, dangerous living conditions, and regular abuse the residents were facing. The general public were outraged, and the outrage served parent advocacy groups in a lawsuit in federal court. Parents of Willowbrook's residents filed a class action suit on March 17, 1972. The lawsuit alleged that Willowbrook violated the rights of the residents by the conditions of the Willowbrook Center. The lawsuit intended to have the conditions of Willowbrook improved with immediate action by hiring more staff, providing better medical care, restricting seclusion, improper physical restraints, and providing appropriate clothing and living conditions for the residents. The plaintiffs alleged that the Willowbrook Center violated the right to treatment under the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, and that the denial of an education violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. In April 1973, Judge Oren G. Judd dismissed the plaintiffs' arguments about treatment rights and education. However, Judge Oren G. Judd did find that the conditions at Willowbrook did violate rights, and that the residents were not protected from harm. According to Judge Judd, the plaintiff's constitutional right to protection from harm in a state institution meant that the residents of Willowbrook were entitled to at least the same living conditions as prisoners. This right, he continued, may rest on the 8th Amendment, the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, based on irrational discrimination between prisoners and the innocent disabled people. Accordingly, Judge Judd granted much of the requested injunctive relief, including prohibiting the use of seclusions and restraints, increasing medical, therapeutic staffing, and requiring regular progress reports. The case went to trial on October 1st, 1974, with the parties continuing negotiations for months afterwards. The case was settled on April 30th, 1975, when Judge Judd signed the Willowbrook consent judgment. The Willowbrook consent judgment set forth guidelines and requirements for the institution and made new standards of care for all residents at the Willowbrook Centre at the time of the settlement. These standards were based on the recognition that people with developmental disabilities are capable of physical, intellectual, emotional, and social growth. The consent judgment set specific procedures and instructions for treatment of residents, covering issues such as resident living, the environment, hiring of staff, education, food and drink, medical care, therapies, use of restraints, and conditions for research and experimental treatment. Significantly, the consent judgment also stated the institution's primary goal and the New York Department of Mental Hygiene to prepare each resident for life in the community, and called for the placement of Willowbrook residents in less restrictive living conditions. The consent judgment set a goal of reducing the number of residents living at Willowbrook to no more than 250. By 1981, although this did not prove feasible, although the case kept ending up in court again and again, in disputes over the ongoing implementation of the consent decree, it wasn't fully implemented until 1987, when the Willowbrook State School and Hospital officially closed. In order for the abuse to stop, it took actually having the place closed down, and the court case was nearly a decade long. Applied behaviour analysis is an intervention typically used on autistic people to modify behaviour. They had the same goal as the usage of psychotropic pills on autistic children. Just after World War II, someone called Oliver Lovas immigrated from Norway to the United States to study psychology under Boris Frederick Skinner, the father of operant conditioning. B.F. Skinner experimented on rodents and pigeons in cages often taught in psychology courses as Skinner's box. Skinner was able to modify the behaviours of the rodents and pigeons using a process abbreviated as ABC, standing for antecedent, behaviour, consequence. The consequences Skinner gave the animals reshaped their behaviour. Once Oliver Lovas saw this, he opened a clinic now called the Judge Rottenberg Educational Centre. Lovas wanted to test his own theories. At the time, we didn't know much about autism, that the only autistic children were unable to speak and express their grief in ways non-autistic people can understand. Lovas saw these children as perfect targets to test his theories on, since they could not rebel or fight back against the abusive behaviour modification. He did to these children exactly what Skinner did to rodents and pigeons, including giving them electronic shocks. This has caused great controversy in applied behaviour analysis today. The fact that Oliver Lovas and the government approach treating disabled children just like rodents shows even while the eugenics movement was in the shadows, people still had eugenic attitudes, believing disabled people are inferior. The Autistic Self-Advocacy Network writes on its site, I quote, "The Judge Rotenberg Center is an institution in Massachusetts. People with intellectual and developmental disabilities, mental health disabilities, and learning disabilities live there. Both kids and adults live at the JRC. Many autistic people live there. Some people at the JRC are forced to wear an electronic shock device. This device is used to punish the person wearing it. The device punishes people by giving them electric shocks. These electric shocks are very painful. The JRC shocks people for small things, like refusing to take off their jackets or stimming." End of quote. The problems with ABA started early on, beginning with Lorbas's own beliefs. You start pretty much from scratch when you work with an autistic person, he told Psychology Today in 1974. You have a person in the physical sense, they have hair, a nose, a mouth, but they are not people in the psychological sense. This lack of humanity, Lorbas did not stop saying, justified using electric shocks, slaps, withholding of food and other forms of physical punishment to extinguish autistic traits, even joyful ones, and replace them with so-called normal behaviors. Simultaneously, Lorbas was using the same methods to treat suspected homosexuals and transgender people, conversion therapy, which was quickly recognized as a human rights abuse. The same reasoning that propelled the research community to turn away from using operant conditioning on LGBTQ people, it was not seen as necessary to stop using the method on autistic children. Instead, proponents charged ahead, even though Lorbas's own study does not come close to what many current researchers deem credible. ABA has never been for the benefit of autistic children. It was for the benefit of parents and to build an entire industry to use the bodies of autistic people to make profit. ABA was founded in 1961 and behaviorism was already outdated science. Around 1930, we had progressed to cognitive psychology, building on top of behaviorism. By the 1950s, we were poking brains moving into biopsychology, and we have learned far more since then. As Isaac Newton taught, if I can see further, it's because I'm standing on the shoulders of a giant. Science builds on top of itself. As errors are found, they get corrected. Finding errors is actually progression, not failure. Dr. Gera Mate writes, I quote, "When I got into psychiatry, Dr. Perry told me, it became clear really quickly that the diagnoses were not connected to the physiology, that they were just descriptive, and that there were hundreds of physiological roots to someone having an attention problem, for example. And yet, the profession acted as if these descriptive labels were really a thing. I knew that if we were doing research, if we were using these hollow descriptors, which we call diagnosis, and then study interventions and outcomes, we would just get garbage. And that's what we've done." End of quote. A growing body of research from, among other sources, the US Department of Defense and the multidisciplinary team of university scholars called Project AIM has found the evidence base for ABA is too thin and of too poor quality to justify its widespread adoption. The majority of studies have found it effective and rife with industry conflicts of interest. Amy Sequenzia, an autistic activist, says, I quote, "Not surprisingly, The majority of ABA proponents are making a lot of money by stealing the childhood of autistic children. 40 hours a week of drills, plus homework. The children don't experience their own personal development. This is considered abuse if done to non-autistics, and then we have to hear that we cost too much money. Wrong. ABA therapists cost too much money. Take them out of our lives. Let autistic children be children. Let autistics develop in our own time, learning about ourselves, learning self-determination. I can hear the apologists. My ABA is not like that. If you bill ABA prices, if you want to change how an autistic acts, reacts, or interacts with the world, and your ideal model is a neurotypical type of behavior, your ABA as bad as I described it. End of quote. In 1961, Oliver Lovas in UCLA opened a place today known as the Judge Rottenberg Educational Center. Applied Behaviour Analysis therapists will deny that the JRC is actually a part of ABA. They'll try to distance themselves from it because it's an exception. The Judge Rottenberg Educational Center is the only school that practices electroconvulsive therapy in the United States. It has been outlawed nearly everywhere else. 4 children, like the autistic children Leo Connor described, were taken to the University of California, Los Angeles, to be studied. The children were studied by Lovas in a clinic called Behavior Research Institute. Oliver Lovas used operant conditioning on the children to modify their behavior. He set his clinic up in the same way as Skinner's box. There was an electric floor, scoldings and smacks, and rewards. If the children did what they were told, they were given a reward. If they didn't do what they were told, they were punished with aversives. If the aversives didn't work, he put them on the electric floor by themselves and kept shocking them with voltages high enough to kill them. One of the children, 9 years old, called Pamela, was progressing in learning to read and other instructions, but she suddenly stopped progressing and began drifting off. B.F. Skinner had already taught aversives don't make a person any less inclined to do something. It just makes them learn to avoid the punishment. When they figure out they can't avoid it, they develop learned helplessness and are desensitized. Pamela was taken to the shock room and was repetitively shocked by metallic strips on the ground. It didn't take long for the BRI to become controversial. Between 1981 and 1990, there were 3 deaths. After the second death, the Office for Children wanted the JRC closed and outlawed. There was a hearing at court with Judge Ernest Rottenberg in Bristol County Probate Court. Sadly, Ernest ruled in favour of continuing the use of shock and aversive therapies. The Behaviour Research Institute was renamed after Judge Rottenberg, making it the Judge Rottenberg Center. From 1990, the JRC began using aversives and shocks even more painful, claiming it's the only way to save their lives. ABA is still seen in the US as the golden standard. The center was doing new research and found that through 40 hours a week of one-to-one therapy, autistic children could attain normal functioning. And by 1993, Lovas condemned his 1960s self, saying shock therapy produced no long-term gains, even though B.F. Skinner had already proven punishments have no positive lasting effects. It was around this time the autism rights movement was starting. The Judge Rottenberg Center has been paid millions in taxpayer money to traumatize residents. New York City alone gives $30 million annually to the Judge Rottenberg Centre's where to warehouse more than 120 of its residents. You may ask, if this treatment is really torture, why is JRC still in business? One answer may be that JRC pays thousands to lobby lawmakers and government administrators to turn a blind eye. In 2010, JRC paid Ruby law firm $100,000 for his influence peddling. In short, there is no excuse for supporting the Judge Rottenberg Centre's program of torture. This is what Professor Alicia A. Broderick means, that we can only understand autism within capitalism itself. It's all about the money. In 2012, the shock devices were exposed to the public during a lawsuit on the news channel. I quote, "When Andre McCollin's case went to trial in 2012, JRC defended the 31 shocks he received after not taking his coat off as a part of his treatment plan. In other hands, the electrical burns and other injuries he received, injuries he has still not fully recovered from 16 years later, were the result of the graduated electronic decelerator being used as intended." Former JRC staff member Gregory Miller reported that what happened to Andre, who was a teenager in 2002, when he sustained permanent harm as a result of a dangerous treatment, was not atypical. JRC residents on the GED are often shocked repeatedly for minor infractions because they do not understand the rules or why they are being shocked, and they repeat the action for which they are being shocked. End of quote. On the news channel, the reporter was questioning the staff defending the JRC. He pointed out it's forbidden and illegal to shock criminals in prison and animals, then asked, "If this is all peer-reviewed and successful and safe, why is the JRC the only place giving aversive and shock therapies? If it's forbidden to treat criminals and animals this way, what makes it acceptable to do it to autistic people?" End of quote. The staff defending the therapy lied back as an answer. There was already great evidence it has no lasting effects, and it was already witnessed 3 deaths occurred. The Food and Drug Administration still hasn't stopped the JRC using shock devices on residents. Even though there's better interventions available, if they accept the better interventions to help the residents, there will no longer be ABA and will lose their insurance. Applied Behaviour Analysis records all its cases inside the Journal of Applied Behaviour Analysis. Oliver Lobas and someone called George Reckers used ABA techniques and operant conditioning to convert a feminine boy called Kirk Murphy to conform to being masculine. In October 2020, Jabba refused to disavow the abuse they did to Kirk, disallowing him human autonomy, and did things much worse. Jabba has faced a great level of criticism from today's ABA therapists, from behaviour technicians to board-certified behaviour analysts. After all the abuse that has been done to autistic children in ABA throughout its toxic history, and all the controversy it stirred up on the internet, therapists know they can't afford to have more patients living and sharing experiences of trauma caused by ABA. Reckers and Lobas published a paper about the project in 1974, and the therapists wanted it to be retracted. Jabba chose to respond to the critics, both in and out of the ABA industry. ABA therapists aren't taught that ABA is actually a multi-billion-dollar per year operation in dealerships of private equities. They published what's called a statement of concern, but continued refusing to retract the paper making excuses based on ethics and how the project was conducted. In their lab, Rex and Lorbaz subjected Kirk Murphy, when he was 4 years old, to a reward and punishment system to condition Kirk to stop exhibiting feminine behaviours. Each time Kirk exhibited a feminine behaviour, he was physically punished, but rewarded for masculine behaviours. B.F. Skinner had already discovered, while investigating the behaviour of rodents and pigeons, that punishments only make people suppress behaviours, and by suppressing them, they become more inclined to exhibit the behaviour, not less. So Rex and Lorbaz intentionally contradicted peer reviews and evidence Skinner gathered. What Rex and Lorbaz did to Kirk Murphy was unethical in 1974. It's unethical now. And therapists and scientists say this paper does not belong in the scientific canon. When a journal retracts a paper after it's been published, it is because the paper is so fundamentally flawed that it doesn't deserve to be in the scientific literature. Those flaws can be related to making up data, false analysis, or ethical violations. In Rex and Lorbaz's paper, the ethical violation in question was the use of aversive techniques, physical and psychological abuse of Kirk, even though he was only 4 years old, because he engaged in feminine behavior. In the United States in 2021, a team called Psychological Bulletin, a team that looks through science literature to see the quality of the science and how it's conducted. Psychological Bulletin assessed all the literature of all the various interventions for autistic children, not just ABA. Even though ABA is said to be the golden standard, Psychological Bulletin concluded ABA is so poorly conducted that it's not even worthy of being included in a data analysis. They saw an intervention called DIR Floor Time by child psychiatrist Stanley Greenspan, based on relationships and human development, not just healthier, but better. Former BCBA called Joe Ram says, I quote, "What does ABA do with autistics? Escape extinction for the win. Ignore and redirect for the win. No concern for the child's feelings. Little effort made, the learning environment more tailored to their needs. Nothing about child developmental needs are incorporated into ABA's work with autistics. Meanwhile, we give them terrible coping techniques like asking them not to show their feelings and to eat their feelings, suppress them with pieces of candy. This also reinforces the child that their dissent, choice in how they learn, consent, and voice don't matter. ABA teaches autistic children to shut up and fall in line." End of quote. By a former BCBA called Joe Ram. George Reckers wrote an article in 1977 trying to rationalise his and Lorbaz's project. He wrote he collaborated with Kirk's parents to punish feminine behaviour to justify his desire to prevent transsexualism, transvestism, or homosexuality, which he and Lorbaz feared. Reckers, who described 4-year-old Kirk as having slovenly seductive eyes, and Lorbaz coached Kirk's parents to praise him when he played with masculine toys and to ignore him when he played with feminine toys. At home, Rex and Lorbaz took an evidence-based intervention called the token economy, think sticker chats and point systems, and used it as a tool to shame and abuse a 4-year-old. This was not actually an evidence-based practice. Kirk's parents were instructed to use red and blue points with him. If Kirk earned too many red points for acting in feminine ways, he either lost blue points, went into timeout, or was spanked by his father. These spankings were extremely severe. As told to journalist Jim Burrower, Kirk's brother remembered that, "I saw my brother's whole backside bruised so badly one time. My dad should have gone to jail for it." End of quote. Behaviour therapists have always reported their treatment methods and made these as explicit as possible. In addition, negotiated goals and the final outcome must be objectively monitored. Reckers and Lobas have, by publishing this study, placed themselves in the proper position of being accountable to their profession. We agree with the authors if their broad goals are to assure happiness for young children when they grow up. We question the methods that appear to be the result of these researchers' own sexual stereotyping. Only time and monitoring will tell the outcome. End of quote. In the Journal of Applied Behaviour Analysis. The statement of concern from JABA, written by Dr. Linda LeBlanc, notes that the study was federally funded. She argued that the findings were empirically valid, and the available evidence does not make it clear that the original study was unethical by the standards of the day. The world and the psychological community in the early 70s would disagree. Speaking to Retraction Watch, a blog that tracks retractions across science, NYU medical ethics professor Arthur Kaplan stated that, "I think many would have found punishing this behavior wrong by the standards of the day, so I am not persuaded this note is accurate." Indeed, from at least 1970, LGBTQ activists within the outside psychiatry were demanding that homosexuality be removed from the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It finally was in 1973, with a majority of voting members of the American Psychiatric Association approving that decision, and immediately following the publication of Reckers and Lobas's paper, two different sets of authors submitted ethical complaints about the paper. One of these authors, Donald Baer, is a foundational member of the field. Put simply, there's more than abundant evidence that this paper was considered unethical in 1974. Like any other science, researchers and practitioners in applied behaviour analysis must face the filthy history in their closet and the criticisms of their field. Reckers and Lobas abused Kirk Murphy, a cisgender gay man who ultimately committed suicide in 2003. The words used and actions described in Reckers and Lobas's paper are abusive and shameful. They did not have value in 1974, but do not have value now. They say that JABA must retract this paper. Professor Elizabeth B. Torres says, I quote, "Autism is at an inflection point today. We are poised for a paradigm shift in autism research, education, and therapies. This book initiates that shift and does so superbly. In the autism industrial complex, how branding, marketing, and capital investment turned autism into big business, we learn about the history and evolution of this multi-billion-dollar-year operation. Thanks to this history, we will remember Lobas, ABA, and behaviorism not as a science, but as a branding, rhetoric, and marketing plot that transiently misguided many well-intended parents and professionals, and that profited with greed by preying on our human hopes, our trust in science, and our fears." End of quote.